Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes, by Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating, and by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, the perspective of a diabetes dad. Tom Karlya has become much more than that since his daughter was diagnosed in 1992 and one of his sons in 2009, with his efforts extending through the community. But he says it all comes back to family.
Communication is the most important thing, and for dads to realize to look for places where you can pick up the ball and run with it, where you can be part of your child's life. Don't let your wife do it. Make yourself part of the solution.
We'll talk to Tom about his story, his work with the Diabetes Research Institute, his acting career, and much more. Tom is a tireless advocate, and if you've never heard him speak, I promise you'll be inspired. In Tell Me Something Good, college sports, school scholarships, and a young JDRF advocate answers my questions. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm so glad to have you along. I am your host, Stacey Simms. We aim to educate and inspire by sharing stories of connection when it comes to type 1 diabetes. My son was diagnosed just before he turned 2, 13 years ago. And I know there's an awful lot of stress in all our lives right now. This is a difficult time, to say the very least. I'm not going to fill you up with a whole bunch of cliches here, but I do hope that as you're listening, you do know that even if it's online, the diabetes community is there for you. We're here to help. We're here to share stories. Hopefully your local community is banding together. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the show. But this week's show is not going to be about COVID-19. It is going to be about some inspiration. You know, with everything that's going on, I thought it would be really nice to have something like this. Tom Karlya and I actually spoke a while ago. And while I was listening back to this interview, like I do all the interviews, it struck me that it sounds a bit like a keynote speech that you would hear at a JDRF summit or another diabetes gathering like Friends for Life. Because all of those conferences have been canceled, I really thought maybe this would make you feel like you're hearing a speaker at a summit, right? So let's listen to it maybe in that vein. And if you're bummed out like I am that those conferences have been canceled, I mean, let's face it, they are for education, they're for learning, they're for resources, but they're also just to get together and see friends, right? You know, maybe this podcast or the Facebook group can be some support for you, a place to hang out. So you can always email me, Stacey@diabetes-connections.com, or jump into the Facebook group, which is Diabetes Connections, the group. I know that diabetes makes us tougher to begin with, right? This is such a great community. And we do know how to help each other out because we do it all the time, right? I think we're seeing some neighbors come together in the greater community, at least where I live. You know, do you need this? And can I go to the grocery store? Well, people with diabetes have been doing that for a long time. So let's just not stop doing it now. As you'll hear Tom say, as he has said for many years, you know, just don't do nothing. You can do a little something and really help. And we'll hear from Tom in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop. And, you know, I spoke to the people at OneDrop, and I was really impressed about how much they get diabetes. It just makes sense. Their CEO, Jeff, was diagnosed with type 1 as an adult. OneDrop is for people with diabetes by people with diabetes. The people at OneDrop work relentlessly to remove all barriers between you and the care you need. Get 24/7 coaching support in your app and unlimited supplies delivered. No prescriptions or insurance required. Their beautiful, sleek meter fits in perfectly with the rest of your life. They'll also send you test strips with a strip plan that actually makes sense for how much you actually check. OneDrop, diabetes care delivered. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo. My guest this week was brought into the diabetes community back in 1992 when his then 2-year-old daughter, Caitlin, was diagnosed. One of his other children, he has 2 other sons, would be diagnosed 17 years later. But Tom Karlya jumped right in to see where he and his family could help, taking part in early JDRF campaigns, the Diabetes Research Institute, and Children with Diabetes. I think Tom, though, would tell you the best thing about him right now is that he's going to be a grandfather. The news came after we had spoken for this interview already, but his daughter Caitlin and her husband Andre are expecting later this summer. And yeah, that's the Caitlin, diagnosed as a baby herself, basically, back in 1992. Here's my talk with diabetes dad, Tom Karlya. Tom, thanks so much for joining me. I cannot believe that I'm just now finally talking to you for the podcast. I appreciate it. I know how busy your schedule is.
Well, the thank yous go to you. I mean, it's I guess they say when people are busy, they're busy, and those are the type of people we like to hang out with. So I know how busy you've been, how busy I've been, and now the twain has met. So that's terrific.
So much to talk about here, and I want to talk about your experiences over these many years. But let's start by, your work with the Diabetes Research Institute Foundation. Do you mind telling us, for people who may not be familiar, what is that?
The Diabetes Research Institute, and the foundation is support for the institute. It is all the money that the foundation raises goes to the Diabetes Research Institute, which is an 87,000 square foot building that sits on the campus of the University of Miami. About 35 years or so ago, when the Diabetes Research Institute Foundation first began, by a group of parents, like many of the diabetes organizations that are out there, somebody there had a connection to the building and construction trade union. And that gentleman said, why don't we try to raise more money for you? And during June, on Father's Day weekend, they created Dads, Dollars Against Diabetes. And they stood on street corners around the country with buckets, and they collected change from anybody stopped at the lights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they continued to do that till they had enough money, and they raised like $14 million, and they took and they built the Diabetes Research Institute, which when it came time, when the building was done, the foundation said, let us name the building after you and all the terrific people of the building trades unions. And they said no. And they said, let's just put a plaque on the wall that said, this building built by the hands and hearts of America's construction unions. And that plaque is still there. It represents a beacon of hope. Nobody expected it to become the research center that so many organizations, the wonderful organizations out there, the JDRFs, the ADAs, the National Institutes of Health, they fund us. We are the scientists doing the work at that center.
So, and DRI, to be clear, if people are not familiar, the work that DRI does is cure-focused research, right?
It's cure-focused. All the stages of research, basic, preclinical, and clinical, happen within one building. A lot of time in academia, you come up with a finding, then you have to go someplace else to find somebody to collaborate with. We go from one floor to the other floor to the other floor. And our saying is, if we can't move it up, we move it out. Because funds are so limited, we have to make sure that we stay focused on that supply, sustainability, and site, which are the three main pillars that we look for to cure this disease once and for all. And there's also a DRI federation. We share all of our information. We hold on to none of it. And we have federations around the world, for that matter, that we share our information with, because in Italy and in China, they can do the research a lot cheaper than we can do here. So a lot of times we'll test things out there, then bring it here and follow through the steps of the FDA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to try to get it from the bench to the bedside.
It's so interesting when you kind of dial down and look at how these things work. And I know that as some people are listening, they may be thinking, well, if it's so cure-focused and it's been around and it's funded, how come we don't have more progress? How come we don't have a cure? I hate to put it in such simple terms, but can you talk a little bit about some of the progress that has been made?
Yeah, and that's, I said this before, that's your mouth to God's ears. That's been our hope since the beginning, and it is such a complex disease. And all the wonderful organizations out there, as well as the research centers out there, this is just not an easy disease to figure out. I mean, years and years ago, when we first, there was nobody funding research years ago for type 1 diabetes. And then to go out there and say, well, we're going to try to cure it. Well, as we went along, and as many other organizations that have, in their wonderful ways, have funded our work and work around the world, for that matter, have found out just how complex this disease is. Years and years ago, we were actually told, we were one of the first centers, and actually Dr. Camilo Ricordi, our scientific director, he invented the machinery with a board member, Ramon Poe, who donated all of his time. They created the machinery to separate the islet cells from the pancreas when they get donated. And we give that to anybody around the world just to help them try to move it forward. But nobody knew that taking islet cells, now this is interesting because I've been at this for 26 some odd years since my daughter was diagnosed at age 2. And there was a time when people thought you will not be able to take islet cells, insulin-producing islet cells, and down years later it became trying to re-engineer stem cells and things to create insulin. There was no proof out there that you could take islet cells and put them in another body and they would work. Well, they did. And and what's happened since that time is that as we move science forward, I think we should do everything we can to try to figure out how do we make islet cells produce insulin in another person's body without being attacked, and why so many of these are on immunosuppression drugs. When we first started, people would say, oh, yeah, but they're on immunosuppression drugs. What people need to understand is that when it came time for these scientific studies, the quality of life of people who entered these research projects, they became patients for the clinical trials. They had no quality of life because they could not feel going hypoglycemic. They could not feel their blood sugar going low. They couldn't drive. They couldn't hold jobs. They'd be talking to people, they'd just keel over. So for a lot of these people, the first islet cell transplants became lifesavers because their quality of life was just non-existent. Something interesting happened when we did that. And around the world, this was done through a lot of different centers and not just at the DRI, but we were at the forefront of it. And the interesting thing about it, even patients that went back on insulin, for the most part, not in every case, but in the majority of the cases, probably even excess is 80%, but that's just my layman's guess, their hypoglycemic reactions went away. Even if the islet cell transplant didn't work and they had to go back on insulin again, they did not suffer from the hypoglycemic episodes that they had. There's always been this great moving science forward, but the truth of the matter is that we will continue to work. And I was active. I was doing other things when Caitlin was first diagnosed. And for those who don't know the story, I was an actor for years. I was in a show in New York for 13, 14 years.
Oh, I want to talk about that.
And we'll get to that. And I've done a lot of great things. But I was on my way to a matinee performance when my beeper went off. You tell people about beepers. They're like, what? What's that? And it just said 911. And I went over to the phone. I can tell you right where it was. I remember to this day. I pulled off of the bridge and on Delancey Street in New York City. I went to a phone booth. For those who don't remember, phone booths are things that had a phone in it.
On the street corner. You talk in front of other people.
On the street corner, right. So I called home, and my wife said, Tom, I have to rush Caitlin to the hospital. They think it's type 1 diabetes. And she had been sick, and she had the flu. And, again, everybody thought it was something else. And when I got to the hospital, which took me 2 hours, that was a whole episode in itself, I looked down the hallway, and I remember my wife, Jill, had Caitlin's jacket. It was hanging from her hands. And we just looked at each other, and I went in, and Caitlin had all these wires and everything attached to her. And I pushed the hair out of her face, and I said, hi, honey. And she said, Daddy. And she looked at everything she was attached to, and she looked me square in the eye, and she said, fix. And it stuck with me. I remember it every day when I start my day. That was a promise I gave my daughter. And I became, whatever I became, I was an advocate and constantly working at it. And then I got really, really angry because I thought my reward was 2009, my 13-year-old son was also diagnosed. So I was pretty angry. And that was also 4 days after my dad died. So when someone tells me they had a flat tire at a supermarket, their week sucked, I said, oh, no, I can beat that.
Well,
so, and here we are.
To have your 2-year-old daughter look you in the eye and say, Daddy, fix, to something that there is no fix.
There isn't.
I don't want to make you relive that moment, but when your son was diagnosed, and Rob was diagnosed 17 years later, the change in the diagnosis, I know it's not a fix. There's no fix yet, But what was your perspective at that time? Because the diagnosis had to be different and the care had to be different. Right back to Tom answering that question in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Real Good Foods. And there is something new from Real Good Foods. They have ice cream. Oh my gosh, Real Good ice cream. My whole family tried it. We have our favorites. I'll share a little bit more specifically down the road. But oh my gosh, the vanilla is delicious. That's the first one we tried, right? Because you can't hide anything with just a vanilla. So we went right to that. I mean, they have other great flavors. They have mint chocolate chip. They have chocolate. They have peanut butter chocolate chip. And we started with the vanilla, and it was really good. It tastes like real ice cream because that is what it is. You can find out more at the website and pre-order. It's available in select stores. As always, there's the store locator on their website. Find out more. Just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. Now back to Tom Karlya, and he is answering my question about how different it was when his son was diagnosed with type 1 17 years after his daughter.
Well, you're absolutely right. And again, the tools, I always use that phrase, the tools in our diabetes toolbox for our kids has become so amazing. We used to have to wait 90 seconds after we pricked Caitlin. At that time, we couldn't even do her fingers. We had to do her toes.
Wow.
So we prick her toe, get a blood drop on a glucometer, and then we would wait 90 seconds. See, if I could help everybody understand one main point that get diagnosed today, then when not only 2009, but 1992, when Caitlin was diagnosed, that the tools we have now are so far advanced. We always say, well, we try to get our children to live normal lives. You literally can live as close to a normal life as you can, except, and there's a huge asterisk, your child has type 1 diabetes. But for those who have it, understand what I mean, that with the technology we now have, Caitlin was the second child on Long Island to go on an insulin pump.
Wow.
Could you imagine? People don't realize that these things were the size of backpacks when they started. It's not, like an astronaut's backpack. They were huge, but they got smaller, they got better, they got quicker. And that's why research to me, that's why I will never give up hope. Somebody looked at somebody checking their blood sugar and they said, we can do better with that. And we have. And it's the same thing with research. As long as there's a research center, and for me, and everybody else can find their own place where to give their time and energy, but the Diabetes Research Institute, the fact that they are focused, now that's a very interesting agreement to have with academia, that we are focused on curing type 1 diabetes. And when we do that, many of the patients, type 2 patients who are on insulin, will probably benefit from that as well. But our focus is to cure this disease. As long as there's a place like the DRI that's focused on curing this disease, then I will never give up hope.
My question on that, you said something very interesting. You said it's a very interesting agreement to make with academia. Do you get pushback from people who want to do research, but it's not cure-focused?
We get not pushback, but we get inquiries from any university has the right to do. And the University of Miami, look, you have to be honest, it's such a wide-range university. It's got so many different aspects to it. But when they come to us and they say, look, can we look at looking into the type 2 type of research? Well, we tell them to go to another part of the campus and look for it. And they do. There are places probably on UM's campus that will focus on complications, transplants. They have a lot of different aspects of UM because it is such a great medical campus on a lot of different ways and areas that they can go someplace else. But when it comes to the Diabetes Research Institute, we have an agreement with them that that's where that focus will stay. And a part of that is, in essence, the Diabetes Research Institute Foundation is the largest donor to the University of Miami through all the money that we give only to the Institute because that's all we'll fund. It won't go anywhere else. And that's because the foundation years ago, the parents had the wherewithal to think down the line, we want to make sure that this institute stays razor focused on a cure. And that's why that agreement is so important to be in place. And we love being part of the University of Miami. They've been very supportive of us. It's a great relationship, and it's been incredible because it also being part of the University of Miami, it gives it the credibility that the world needs to see that this institute is part of academia, but also has razor focus on curing a disease that is only for type 1 diabetes.
Tom, your handle, your blog name has always been Diabetes Dad. And I want to talk to you about being a dad for a moment, if I could. You know, you've spoken many, many times in your blog and when you speak in person about your wife, Jill, and how she took care of the kids' diabetes. You said it, really the responsibility mostly fell on her, that sort of thing. You've given her a lot of credit. But I'm curious, as you look back and your kids are grown up and they're married and, you have a different perspective now. What is your advice to other diabetes dads? I think more men want to do more. I don't know exactly how much you did, but can we talk about being a diabetes dad for a minute and what that means?
Sure. And just to be clear, and this is a very important part of this discussion, the responsibility did not fall on Jill. And actually, when Caitlin was first diagnosed, we sat down and talked because I didn't want to make the decision for myself. I didn't say, well, this is what we're going to do. So she and I sat down and I said, look, one of us has to stay home. And it wasn't, okay, I didn't say, well, I'm going to work and you're going to stay home. We discussed that. And to me, that's one of the biggest keys to parenting with diabetes is keeping that open line of communication and dialogue open. I look at now, I mean, there was a time we almost lost everything because she couldn't work. I had to work. I was working from, 3-4 jobs, whatever it took to keep us moving forward. I knew two things. Income had to keep coming in, and we had to have insurance from that day forward. So everything I did was working toward that. But it came about that I would work the jobs, and she would stay home with the kids, and she would work when she could, if she could. And then it became, we had to find times that I had to realize that this is a partnership in dealing with this disease. So I would say on the days that I could, get out of here, go someplace, go see a movie, go out with friends. We had to try to find time for ourselves as a couple. This is a very strenuous disease in a lot of different areas. And I tell couples and parents all the time, communicate. Make sure you're talking with each other, not at each other. I have to tell you one of my favorite stories. I was at the Children with Diabetes conference in Orlando, Florida, and I usually run the dads group when I'm there.
Yeah.
And there was a man talking, and he said, I'm divorced and this, that, and the other thing. And he said, and I'm here. And the man next to him said, I'm in a second family. I married my wife, and they have a child with diabetes. And it was the father of the child and the new husband of the wife at the same meeting finding it that important to learn about diabetes. And that was one of the most touching things I ever saw. I said, I spoke to the gentleman who was newly married. I said, you're like my new hero.
Wait, I'm confused. So the family gets divorced. The ex is there and the new husband?
That's exactly right.
Wow.
And to me, that's as powerful a statement as that could ever be made, that the child has to come first. And look, divorces I hope never to go through it, and I hope never to have to deal with it, but sometimes it can be very bitter. But you have to remember where your child is with diabetes. It's the same thing when both parents go to work and the grandparents want to be involved. I say this all the time. Grandparents are the most forgotten people when it comes to the family structure and dealing with diabetes because they want to help. But a lot of times it's like mommy telling the son or daughter what to do, and they're kind of, they don't get accepted in as they should. But the grandparents hurt as much as the parents do, if that could be possible, because they want to help, and we have to let them and find the mechanisms for them to do so. So the answer to your question is communication is the most important thing. And for dads to realize, to look for places where you can pick up the ball and run with it, where you can be part of your child's life. Don't let your wife do it. Make yourself part of the solution, and you will be. And that's exactly what we did. And because of what I ended up doing for my life, I ended up being the go-to person for what was new in technology and what was coming down the line, and Jill was dealing the day-to-day management. But that's the balance you will get to. The late Richard Rubin, who was just an incredible man in the world of psyche of diabetes, he's the one who coined the phrase diabetes over wellness. And it happens to all of us. And it's all about balance, and it's all about choices.
Such great advice there. All right, Tom, I got to ask you. You mentioned this earlier that you were acting and you were on all these TV shows, but you were in Tony and Tina's wedding. For people who might not be from the New York area. You're from Long Island. I'm from Westchester County, which is really close by. This was not only a show, this was like a party. Can you try to describe Tony and Tina's wedding?
Yeah, it's what's called point-to-point improvisation. The same things would happen every night, but basically you went to a church in New York City, and then the service would end, and you would walk 3 blocks to the catering hall, and that was in snow, rain, whatever it was, and it was anything that could go wrong in the wedding would go wrong. An old boyfriend shows up. The father is divorced and is going out with this very interesting woman but he used to go out with Tina's mother. I mean, look, the whole thing just becomes a mess. But at the time when it first opened, it was probably the first show that was all about improvisation. Now there's many of them, but they've been in every city just about in the country, and with some of them with long runs, like Chicago ran for a really long time as well. But it was a role it was very interesting for me. I played Tina's. Over the years, I ended up doing 4 different roles. I ended up playing Tony's father. I was Tina's godfather and the host of the catering hall, and he was like this kind of MC who would sing, tell jokes, whatever. But it was all about the engagement of the audience. So the audience, were the guests of Tony and Tina every night, and we would have to interact with them. And the key to that was to listen, because you could pick up something and then come back to that person later and bring it up. And they're like, how did they know that? And it made it all like they were part of the family. And I mean, and there was a time when all these celebrities came, and at one time it was probably one of the hottest tickets in New York. You couldn't get tickets. You had to wait 2 months. Can't imagine it was the Hamilton of the day, but it certainly was a great show, and the audience had a wonderful, wonderful time.
Did you have fun doing that? I mean, I imagine it was very hard work, but it had to also be very kind of exhilarating in a way.
Well, it was an acting job, and it's probably one of the most, exhilarating and challenging to stay in character. My mother came to see the show, and I didn't talk to her anything else but my character. And so it was always fun to make sure that at any given time that we had to stay in character no matter what. Power failure happened once, and we all had to get out of the theater. Well, remember, this is like leaving a catering hall. These people are all sitting around tables all around you. And we all had to stay in character when we did that. So it was a challenge. It was fun. But yes, it was a job that you had to be able to sustain every night. You had to pace yourself. I mean, there was a time we were doing 8 shows a week, and that's a lot of shows. So it's like any training that you do in the acting world. You train yourself to do the role because you tell yourself every night the people seeing the show are seeing it for the first time.
So before I let you go here, give us an update on the kids, the grown-up kids now. How's everybody doing?
My oldest doesn't have it. TJ, he's with the New York State Mental Health Police Department. Wow. Caitlin, now, interesting thing about Caitlin is I remember years and years ago, someone told me you really should just hope for college for your kid. And I said, what are you talking about? You mean she's not going to make college? He said, I'm not saying that. He said, it's just you have to understand how devastating this disease is, but make college a goal. Well, that person didn't stay a friend, clearly. So,
but that was a belief at the time. I've heard from other people who thought that.
Yep. And I think that's one of the keys for all of us is to keep our kids so positive that they can do anything with this disease. And not only did she graduate college, not only did she graduate nursing school, but in December, she graduated with her nurse family practitionership, and she's now a family nurse practitioner, and she's in practice, and hopefully her goal is to deal with people with type 1 diabetes. My youngest son is a computer guru, and he was working for a company called Best Buy, and he got tagged by their Geek Squad when he was 18. And I said, do you like it? He said, yeah, Dad, but that's not where I'm going to stay. And I said, what do you mean? He said, my goal is to be tapped from the Magic Castle. I said, what's the Magic Castle? He said, it's the corporate headquarters in Minnesota. I said, well, that's a lofty goal. He said, well, that's my goal. Well, earlier this year, my wife and I went and saw my son's new office at the executive row in Best Buy in that building that they are all in, and looked at his new office because they did just that when he was 21. They tapped him on the shoulder and they brought him out there. And he now works for the corporate headquarters for Best Buy and Geek Squad. Now, I share that not just because of who they are, but if you have a dream, if your child has a dream, our job as parents is to do everything we can to help them fulfill their dream. That was my son's dream. He's been there now for 2 years in Minnesota doing just what he always wanted to do.
That's just wonderful. I mean, I'm getting kind of emotional actually as you're talking about it. I think it's incredible. because you have to let them pursue what they want, to let them dream. And when type 1 diabetes comes along, it's kind of easy to think to yourself, well, maybe we should dampen down the expectations. And you didn't do that for any of your kids. And your mantra has always been, at least since I've known you, is just don't do nothing. So for people who are listening, you don't have to, be a senior vice president of the Diabetes Research Institute. You don't have to, speak all over the country like you do. But as we leave here, is that really your advice? Just, try to do something?
It started with a step. If you told me back then that I'd end up where I was today, I would have told you you're crazy. It starts with a step. If you're looking for something to do, hang posters around your community about the warning signs for diabetes. There's a mom in Texas. She and I connected years ago and created getdiabetesright.org. And all that is posters that you can download and put around your community for people to know about the warning signs of type 1 diabetes. And we're not alone. Beyond Type 1 does it. A whole bunch of other people, JDRF does it. All these people have these warning signs. It starts with you looking in the mirror saying, the status quo of diabetes in my life just will not do. What can I just start asking the question? What can I do? JDRF started by parents. The Diabetes Research Institute Foundation started by parents. People out there doing things, podcasts out there. Stacey Simms says, got to do something. This is my background. This is what I can do. This is what I'm going to do. It's something. There's nothing so small that cannot change a life around just by starting with the first step. This disease will not do in this world, my world, or any world, and look for something you can do to change it.
Tom, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a thrill to hear your story and to talk to you today. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, and thank you for everything you continue to do. And these are the stories that people need to hear, because there's a lot of people out there who don't know that what they can do and how they can do it. And that's what just people need to just keep hearing these stories so they get, there's so many people out there that are so inspired now in professional sports and dance and drama and theater and studies and school, excelling. Diabetes just won't do, and just don't do nothing when it comes into your life.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
You can find out more about Tom at diabetes-connections.com. In the episode homepage, of course, I will link up information to his blog, to the DRI, to everything else we talked about. And there is a transcription, just like there is for every episode this year. And I am working to fill in the blanks on transcriptions in the past as well, because I'm getting such a great response. I wasn't sure, right? Do people want transcriptions? Is it worth the time? Let me tell you, it is totally worth it. I've been hearing from so many people who maybe just don't have time to listen or prefer to read. And it's a service I am more than happy to provide, as frankly, the technology is getting better. It's still not perfect. I mean, most of these transcription services do not speak diabetes. So I've had to go through and fix a few things, but I'm happy to do it because I think it really is enhancing everybody's experience. So thank you very much for the feedback on that. Up next, tell me something good. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. When you have a toddler diagnosed with type 1, like I did, like Tom did, you do hear rumblings for a very long time about the teen years. But when it hit us at full force, a little early, frankly, I was so glad we had Dexcom. It just helped us see and really take stock of the changes we made, because Benny's insulin needs started going way up around age 11. He's 15 now, and it's almost settling down. I don't want to get too personal, but along with the hormone swings, I can't imagine managing diabetes during that time because we made so many changes. Without the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system, we react more quickly to highs and lows, see those trends, and adjust insulin doses with advice from our endocrinologist. And I know using the Dexcom G6 has helped improve Benny's A1C and overall health. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Our Tell Me Something Good stories this week come from a Facebook group called Poked, Parents of Kids Experiencing Diabetes. I'm part of that group, and I posted that I was looking for good news stories, and oh my goodness, did they deliver. So let me bring you a couple. Sarah wrote, my daughter just signed to play college soccer. She is so excited to keep breaking down misconceptions about type 1 and sports. Susan says, my daughter with type 1 diabetes earned a scholarship and direct admit into a competitive nursing program. She's in her freshman year living on campus and successfully handling it all. Her goal is to be a diabetes educator. And then Beth wrote in, this kiddo, Frankie, who has lived more of her life post type 1, is rocking Control IQ, the new software from Tandem. Beth says slightly off label since she's barely 6 and definitely under 55 pounds, and just got invited to present on a panel at JDRF Type 1 Nation in Denver. That was a couple of weeks ago before everything was canceled. But I asked Beth to ask Frankie, since she was on a panel, I had some questions for her. And Beth was happy to oblige, and Frankie answered my questions. So my first question was, what is one thing she would tell a kid her age who was just diagnosed with type 1? And Frankie said, I would tell them it's okay. Don't be afraid, and you can still do everything you want. And then I said, what's something she does to feel better when she has a hard day? And Frankie responded, I tell my mom and dad when I've had a bad day. Then we usually do something special together to make me feel better. Again, Frankie is 6 years old, and she was diagnosed at 2. Beth, thank you so much for sending that in. Thanks to all the parents for responding to my prompt in the group. I really appreciate it. If you have a Tell Me Something Good story you just want to share about your kid or yourself, it can be everything that you heard. It can be a diversary, just, with everything that's going on. Let's have some good news in our community. I love it. It's my favorite part of the show each week. And I really would love to hear from you. Before I let you go, just a quick note on everything that's going on. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I was going to talk a little bit about local groups. And all I really want to say about that is if you have a local Facebook group, as many of us do, just check in on each other. If you have a local text chain or WhatsApp or things like that, maybe your kids have a diabetes camp. I don't even know what kids are using. I was going to say WhatsApp group, but you know what the kids are on TikTok or whatever. Check in with their camp community or other people you may know through your local JDRF chapter. If you're an adult with an adult group, please check in on each other. If you have nobody, if you're concerned, you're by yourself, you're worried, we're here, right? I don't know what we can do other than say we can help. I don't want to make empty promises, but I do think it's really important that we get social connection during this scary time, which really can lead to in real life help. I know that in my community, when somebody needs insulin, we get it to them. When somebody needs a Dexcom sensor, we get it to them if we can. The diabetes community for a very long time has already taken care of the people within it. And I hope that that spirit extends to the whole community during this scare. But at the very least, if there are people in your diabetes community that you can help, let's find a way to do so. If you're halfway across the country, there are so many ways to connect that it's really not that hard to find somebody nearby. So, hey, Diabetes Connections listeners, that's my challenge for you over these next couple of weeks. I know most of you are already doing it, but if you've listened this far, if you're hearing my voice at this point, check in on your diabetes friends, check in on your community, and let's see what we can do to help each other. We may never need the help, but it is nice to know it's there. I think that goes an awfully long way. All right. Again, I don't know what I'm doing in terms of scheduling for the next couple of weeks. I'm not going to do lots and lots of coronavirus episodes. I don't know that they're needed. I think I will check in if I can with some endocrinologists over the next couple of weeks. Maybe we'll do some Facebook Live. You tell me what you want to hear. But in the meantime, right now, I am planning to go back to the regularly scheduled Diabetes Connections episodes. I have a few that I've recorded already, a few interviews, and I think we'll just put those out as planned, and we will go from there. Thanks, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening and for letting me into your lives right now. I really appreciate it. I'm Stacey Simms, and I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.